close your eyes now, or let them stay soft and half open, if that feels more natural to you. There is nowhere you need to be tonight. There is nothing you have forgotten. There is nothing waiting for you on the other side of this moment. You are here. Just here. And I'm going to tell you a story, a very quiet story, about a man named Giacomo, about the city he lived in, about the maps he made, and about the slow, ordinary, beautiful life that passed through his hands like water. Let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you are resting. Feel the weight of your body. Feel how supported you are. The floor, or the mattress, or the cushions beneath you. They are holding you completely. You don't have to hold yourself up at all. Let that be true for a moment. Let yourself be held. Now, let me take you somewhere. The city of Venice, in the early 16th century, was a place that existed just slightly outside the rest of the world. Not because it was distant, not because it was hidden, but because it was built on water. Imagine, for a moment, a city with no roads, no horses, no carts rattling over cobblestones. Instead, canals, narrow ribbons of dark green water threading between buildings the colour of rose and amber and old cream. Gondolas moving through them like long black leaves carried by a gentle current. The sound of oars, the low knock of wood against stone, the occasional soft call of a gondolier rounding a corner. And above it all, the sky, wide and pale in the mornings, turning gold by afternoon, and at dusk, becoming that particular shade of pink and violet that exists, perhaps, only over Venice. This was Giacomo's city. He had been born here, in a narrow house near the Rialto Bridge. On a winter morning when the canals were wrapped in fog so thick you could barely see the building across the water. His mother had told him this story many times. She said the midwife arrived by boat, appearing out of the mist like something from a dream. Giacomo grew up with the sound of water always beneath him. He learned to walk on uneven stone. He learned to navigate by bridges and landmarks. The leaning chimney, the painted doorway, the old stone face carved into the wall above the baker's shop. As a boy, he was quiet. His mother called him the still one. Not still like something frozen, but still like a deep pond, calm on the surface, full of things below. He liked to sit on the edges of bridges and watch the boats pass. He liked to draw in the margins of his schoolbooks, not pictures of animals or battles or the heroic scenes the other boys preferred. He drew places, the shape of a rooftop, the way 3 streets came together at an angle, the curve of a canal, the position of a church tower in relation to the horizon. His teacher noticed. An old man with ink-stained fingers and round spectacles that magnified his eyes. He noticed how Giacomo's drawings were accurate. Not just pleasing to look at, but accurate. As if the boy had measured each line, each angle, without any instrument at all. You see the world as it is, the old teacher told him once. Not as we imagine it, not as we wish it, but as it is. Giacomo didn't know what to do with this observation at the time. He was perhaps 12 years old. He simply nodded and looked back at the canal. But the words stayed with him. They settled into him quietly, like sediment drifting to the floor of a still pool. By the time Giacomo was a young man, perhaps 22, perhaps 23, he had found his way to the workshop of a mapmaker. The workshop was on a small island, connected to the main city by a single narrow bridge. You could hear the water on all sides of it. The building was old. Its walls were thick and slightly damp, the way walls near water always become over centuries. The stone floor was worn smooth in certain paths. The path from the door to the main work table, from the work table to the ink cabinet, from the ink cabinet to the window that faced the lagoon. These paths were worn by decades of footsteps, by mapmakers who had come before, by hands and eyes and careful minds who had stood in this room and traced the shape of the world. When Giacomo first arrived, the workshop belonged to an old man named Sandro. Sandro was perhaps 70, small and slightly bent, with white hair that stood out from his head in gentle disarray and enormous, capable hands. He moved through the workshop the way old craftsmen move, slowly, deliberately, with an economy of motion that came not from laziness, but from a lifetime of knowing exactly what was necessary and what was not. He spoke very little. This suited Giacomo. On Giacomo's first morning in the workshop, Sandro set a blank sheet of paper on the work table. Thick, cream-coloured paper, slightly rough to the touch, and placed beside it a single pen and a small pot of ink. Then he went to his own table and began working without explanation. Giacomo stood for a long moment, looking at the blank paper. Then he sat down, and he began. He drew what he knew. He drew Venice, the outline of the islands, the curve of the Grand Canal, the position of the major churches and bridges. He drew slowly, from memory, from feeling, from the accumulated knowledge of a lifetime of watching this city from bridges and doorways and the edges of boats. At midday, Sandro came and stood behind him. He looked at the drawing for a long time. He said nothing. Then he returned to his own table. That evening, as the light was going gold over the lagoon, and the workshop was filling with the particular warm smell of stone and ink and wood that Giacomo would come to love more than almost any other smell in the world, Sandro looked up from his work. "Come back tomorrow," he said. That was all. Come back tomorrow. Giacomo came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Making maps, Giacomo learned, was not a fast art. It was not dramatic. It required no great inspiration, or rather, the inspiration came in such small, incremental ways that it was barely distinguishable from ordinary attention. It was an art of patience, an art of looking carefully, an art of translating what the eye saw and what the mind understood into marks on paper that would allow a stranger in some faraway place to find their way. Sandro taught him slowly. There was no curriculum, no sequence of lessons, just the daily presence in the workshop, the side-by-side working, the occasional quiet observation. "Hold the pen here," Sandro said once, adjusting Giacomo's grip without explanation, and Giacomo held it differently from then on and found that his lines were steadier, more even, more alive. "The sea is never one colour," Sandro said another time, watching Giacomo paint a stretch of open ocean. "Look at it. Really look at it." Giacomo looked. He began to see the variations. The deep indigo at the centre, the paler blue toward the horizon, the greenish tint near the shore, the small flecks of white where the light caught the surface. He mixed his colours differently after that, more carefully, more honestly. In those early years, Giacomo mostly assisted Sandro. He ground the pigments for the paint. He prepared the paper, stretching it, sizing it, letting it dry in the particular way that prevented warping. He mixed the inks to Sandro's exacting specifications. each one slightly different depending on the purpose. The fine line ink for borders and coastlines, the thicker ink for labels, the very thin, translucent ink for shading the mountains so they appeared to have depth and shadow. He copied Sandro's lettering over and over until his hand could form each letter with the same controlled elegance. The letters on a map, Sandro had told him, must be readable first, beautiful second. But if you practice enough, they become both at once. Giacomo practiced. He practiced in the evenings, at home, by candlelight. He practiced on scraps of paper, on the backs of old letters, on any surface that would accept ink. His hand grew sure, steady and sure. The days in the workshop had a rhythm that Giacomo found deeply comforting. He arrived each morning not long after sunrise. The walk from his small rented room took him across 2 bridges and along one of the wider canals, where the fish sellers were already setting out their catches on beds of crushed ice. The fish gleamed silver and pink in the early light. The sellers called to one another. Cats, thin and knowing, watched from windowsills and ledges. The smell of bread came from a bakery halfway along the route. Warm and yeasty and deeply ordinary, the smell of a morning that had no ambitions beyond being itself. Giacomo usually bought a small roll from the baker, a man named Pietro, who was enormously wide and enormously cheerful, and who told the same 3 jokes on a rotating cycle, without any apparent awareness that they were the same 3 jokes. Giacomo always laughed, not from politeness, but because Pietro's enjoyment of his own jokes was, in itself, something worth witnessing. He ate the roll on the last stretch of the walk, crossing the small bridge to the island, feeling the slight sway of the stone beneath him. Bridges in Venice sometimes have a very slight movement to them, a breathing, almost, as if the city itself is alive and resting gently on the water below. By the time he reached the workshop, Sandro was already there. Had always, it seemed, already been there for some time. There was always fresh ink on his brush, always a map in some stage of completion on the work table. They would greet each other with a nod, perhaps a few words about the weather, the quality of the light, the direction of the wind. Then they would work. The workshop was quiet, not silent. There was always the sound of water, the distant sound of the city, the soft scratch of pen on paper, the occasional clink of a tool against a glass jar. But quiet in the way that matters, without urgency, without noise that demanded anything. Quietness that held you, that let you think. The maps Sandro made, and that Giacomo was slowly learning to make, were not simply practical documents. They were beautiful objects. In the 16th century, a fine map was something to be treasured. Merchants paid dearly for accurate charts of the sea routes they depended on. Noblemen commissioned maps of distant lands they would never visit. Libraries displayed them. Scholars studied them. Travellers carried them, worn and folded and precious, in leather satchels against their bodies. A good map was more than directions. It was an act of imagination. It was an attempt to hold the whole curved earth in the flat surface of a single sheet of paper. The maps in Sandro's workshop showed coastlines and harbours and the mouths of rivers. They showed mountain ranges drawn as small repeated hills marching across the interior of continents, a convention that was not entirely accurate, but which gave a sense of height and difficulty, which was perhaps what mattered most to a traveller facing them. They showed cities marked with small drawings of their most distinctive towers and domes. They showed the routes of trade winds with curling decorative lines. They showed compass roses, elaborate, many-pointed stars, each point labelled with a direction, drawn with such care and detail that they were nearly works of art in themselves. In the borders of the maps, there were often decorative elements, small illustrations of sea creatures, some accurate, some fantastical, whales and dolphins and fish with elaborate scales, but also creatures that no sailor had ever truly seen. Serpents rising from the water, fish with the heads of dogs, enormous tentacled things curled in the margins of unknown seas. These were not meant to deceive. They were meant to say, here there are things we do not know. The world is larger than our knowledge of it. Go carefully. Giacomo loved the borders of maps. He loved the small figures that sometimes populated them. A native person from a distant continent, drawn with respectful curiosity, dressed in unfamiliar clothing, holding unfamiliar objects, surrounded by the plants and animals of a place that the mapmaker had only heard described, second hand. There was something humble about these figures, something that acknowledged we know this place exists, but we do not yet fully understand it. We are only beginning. As Giacomo's skills grew, Sandro began giving him larger portions of the work. He would trace the basic outline of a map, then hand it to Giacomo to fill in the details. The shading of the land, the colouring of the sea, the placement of place names in neat, careful lettering. Giacomo worked with great concentration. He worked the way people work when a task suits them so precisely that it stops feeling like effort and becomes instead a kind of flow, a state in which the hands know what to do without the mind needing to direct them, in which hours pass without any sense of their passing, in which the world outside the work table disappears completely. He would sometimes look up and be surprised to find that the light had shifted entirely, that the morning had become afternoon without his noticing, that the candle he'd lit against the afternoon shadow had burned down to a small stub. Time, in the workshop, moved differently. It moved the way time moves in a dream, not in a straight line, not with urgency, but in loops and pools and long, gentle stretches. Giacomo's room was small. He had rented it from a widow named Signora Caterina, who lived below him and who had the remarkable ability to be deeply suspicious of everyone while remaining fundamentally kind. She suspected him of being untidy, which was accurate. She suspected him of forgetting to eat, which was also accurate. She periodically left small plates of food outside his door, leftover soup, a piece of cheese, a handful of olives from a jar she kept in her kitchen, while maintaining a facial expression that suggested she was doing no such thing and would deny it if asked. Giacomo liked her very much. His room faced the water. This was its best feature. The window was not large, a rectangle of light, perhaps the width of 2 outstretched hands, but it looked out over a narrow canal, and beyond the canal, through a gap between 2 buildings, to a wider stretch of water, where on clear days you could see all the way to the line where the lagoon met the sky. In the mornings, the light came through this window and lay across the floor in a long, pale stripe. In winter, when the light was low, this stripe reached almost to the opposite wall. In summer, it was shorter, brighter, more insistent. Giacomo had learned to read the season by the length of that stripe of light, by whether it reached the edge of his work table or only the foot of his bed, by whether it was the cool, thin light of January or the thick, rich light of June. His room contained a bed, a narrow one, with a mattress that had been good once and was now merely serviceable, but which he had come to love in the particular way you love something that has accompanied you through many nights. A small table, a chair, a chest for his clothes, and, taking up more space than everything else combined, his own work table. On this table, he kept his practice materials, scraps of paper, small jars of ink in different colours, pens of various sizes, a compass for drawing circles, a ruler, a small knife for cutting and sharpening his pens. The table was always covered, always in a state of productive disorder that only Giacomo could navigate. He knew where everything was. He could find the particular shade of blue he needed in the dark. He could reach for a specific pen without looking. The walls of his room were hung with maps, old ones mostly. Maps he had found at markets, maps that Sandro had given him when they were worn beyond use. Maps he had copied himself as practice. Some were rolled and stored in a wooden rack. Others were pinned to the plaster and had been there long enough that the paper had become slightly wavy and soft. In summer, when the windows were open, they moved very slightly in the breeze. A gentle, slow movement, like breathing. Giacomo spent his evenings in this room. After the walk home from the workshop, after Signora Caterina's mysteriously appearing food, after the particular pleasure of washing his hands and face with cool water, he would sit at his table and work. Not always on anything specific. Sometimes he practiced his lettering. Sometimes he copied a detail from one of the hanging maps. A compass rose, a decorative sea creature, a particularly fine stretch of coastline. Sometimes he simply drew Venice, over and over, from different angles, different scales, different levels of detail. He felt that he could spend a lifetime drawing Venice and never fully capture it. That was all right. The attempting mattered as much as the achieving, perhaps more. On some evenings, he didn't work at all. He sat by the window and watched the canal below, watched the boats, watched the reflections of the opposite buildings in the dark water, wavering, distorted, broken into pieces whenever a boat passed, then slowly reassembling themselves as the water stilled. He found this endlessly interesting. The same building reflected 100 different ways, depending on the light, the wind, the motion of the water. The same world, seen from a slightly different angle, becoming entirely new. That was what maps did, he sometimes thought. They took the world as it was, complicated and large and full of things that had no clear shape, and they held it still for a moment. They said, here is the shape of things. Here is the edge and the center. Here is how far it is from one place to another, and there was comfort in that, a kind of comfort. The seasons came to Venice differently than they came to inland cities. In winter, the fog rolled in off the lagoon. It came slowly, filling the canalways between buildings, muffling all sound. In the morning, the city was barely visible from itself. You could hear a boat before you could see it. You could hear voices from the next bridge without being able to see the people speaking. The fog had a smell, cold and slightly mineral, the smell of deep water and old stone, and the particular dampness of a city that had been sitting in the middle of a lagoon for a very long time. Giacomo liked the fog. He liked the way it turned the city intimate. Venice in summer was an open, expansive thing. Venice in winter fog was small and close, and yours. Just the few streets you could see. Just the building across the canal, its reflection blurred and soft in the grey water. Just the sound of your own footsteps. In the workshop, winter meant working by candlelight well into the morning. The candles guttered slightly when the door opened, casting brief shadows across whatever map lay on the work table. The stone walls held the cold. They wore coats as they worked. Sandro and Giacomo, and sometimes fingerless gloves that left their fingertips free for the fine work. Sandro always had a small brazier of coals in the corner. Not enough to truly warm the room, just enough to take the worst edge off the cold, and to be looked at when you needed a moment of warmth that wasn't about temperature. The orange glow of it, the small sound of coals settling, the way it made the corner of the room feel inhabited and alive. Spring came quietly. First the fog thinned, then the light changed, grew longer, grew warmer in colour, began arriving earlier each morning and leaving later each evening. The birds returned to the city, sparrows in particular, small and quick and everywhere, darting from windowsill to windowsill, squabbling cheerfully over bread crusts. Pigeons in the larger squares, cooing and strutting with their particular self-important dignity. The markets grew fuller. More vegetables, more colour. Herbs tied in bunches, green and fragrant. The first strawberries of the season, small and sweet, laid out in careful pyramids. Spring in the workshop meant opening the window, letting the air move through the room. The sound of water grew louder when the window was open. A lovely sound. The sound of the lagoon at rest. Summer was the fullest season. The days were long and golden and warm in a way that made the stone of the buildings glow a deep, rich amber in the late afternoon light. The canals had a particular smell in summer. Not unpleasant, just alive. Faintly green and wet and ancient. The light on the water was extraordinary. It danced. It moved in patterns that shifted constantly. Small ripples of reflected brightness that played across the undersides of bridges, across the walls of buildings that lined the canal, across the faces of people passing in boats. Giacomo sometimes stopped in the middle of the bridge on his walk to work, just to watch the light on the water for a few minutes. He never quite managed to capture it on paper, but he kept trying. He always kept trying. Autumn arrived with the first coolness in the evening air. A change you could smell before you could feel. Something autumnal in the breeze. Something that suggested harvest and wood smoke and shorter days. The light shifted, became more oblique, came in at lower angles that threw longer shadows and made the same streets look entirely different from the way they had looked in the full height of summer. The markets shifted with the season. Apples now, pears, mushrooms of various kinds, chestnuts, which the vendors roasted over small fires in braziers set up at the edges of the squares. The smell of them mixing with the smell of the canal and the bread and the wood smoke, in a combination that was, to Giacomo, the very smell of autumn in Venice. In the evenings, the city lit itself. Torches and candles and the warm glow from windows. The reflections of these lights in the canal were a different kind of beauty from the daytime reflections. Warmer, more golden, broken into long streaks by the movement of the water. Sometimes people came to the workshop, merchants who had sailed to distant places and wished to have their routes recorded. Sailors who carried rough sketches and verbal descriptions of coastlines they had navigated, wanting these translated into proper charts. Scholars who brought old maps to be corrected, updated, compared. These visitors brought the world to the workshop. They brought stories of places that existed, for Giacomo, only as marks on paper. He listened carefully to everything they said. A Portuguese captain came once, a tall, weathered man with the particular quality of stillness that very experienced sailors sometimes have, as if they have learned through long practice to conserve themselves against the unpredictability of the sea. He had sailed along the western coast of Africa. He described the coastline in careful detail. The color of the cliffs, the shape of the headlands, the particular brown-green of certain rivers as they met the sea. He described the heat. The kind of heat, he said, that you feel not just on your skin but inside you. A heat that slows everything, that makes every motion deliberate, that changes the quality of light and sound and time. Giacomo listened and took notes in the margins of a rough sketch. He looked at the captain's hands when he described the coastline, how they moved, tracing shapes in the air, indicating distances by the width of the spread between his palms. He tried to understand not just the facts, but the feeling of what was being described. A Flemish merchant came who had travelled east, along the Silk Road, or part of it, as far as the great markets of Samarkand. He described the desert, the way it was not, as some imagined it, simply a vast, flat expanse of sand. It had texture and variety, rocky stretches, expanses of gravel, areas where the sand truly did form the great sweeping dunes that appeared in travellers' fantasies, rising and falling like the slow breathing of some enormous sleeping creature. He described the sky over the desert at night, without trees or mountains or buildings to interrupt the horizon, he said. The sky seemed enormous. It seemed to press down. The stars were so numerous and so bright that the darkness between them seemed almost secondary, as if the sky were made primarily of light, with only small dark gaps. Giacomo thought about that for a long time afterward. He had never seen a sky without the shapes of buildings around it, had never seen the horizon as a clean, uninterrupted line in all directions. He tried to imagine it. He could almost feel it. The openness, the exposure, the particular kind of smallness that must come from standing under such a sky. A Greek navigator came with charts of the Aegean, the scattered islands, the channels between them, the way the wind behaved in certain passages at certain seasons. He spoke about the islands with something that was not quite nostalgia, but was adjacent to it. The tenderness of someone describing a place so well known that it has become part of the body's memory. He knew specific rocks by name. He knew where the water deepened and where it grew shallow. He knew which passages were safe in a north wind and which should be avoided. He knew which islands had fresh water and which required a ship to carry its own. This knowledge, Giacomo understood, was hard-won. It had been purchased with years of sailing, with close attention, with the willingness to navigate uncertainty and come out the other side with something learned. He recorded it all as faithfully as he could, translated it into marks and lines and numbers on paper, tried to make the map carry something of the navigator's knowledge, not just the what of the geography, but something of the how it felt to know it. He was not always sure he succeeded, but he tried. He always tried. There was a particular hour in the workshop that Giacomo came to love above all others. It was not a fixed hour. It arrived at different times depending on the season and the weather, but it was always the same quality of light. It happened when the sun had moved to a certain angle, past its highest point, beginning its long, slow descent toward evening, and the light came through the workshop window, not directly, but obliquely, at a shallow angle that sent it sliding across the work table like something liquid. In this light, everything was golden. The cream-colored paper became warm and amber. The ink dried to a rich, dark depth. The wooden surface of the work table seemed to glow from within. Even the air seemed golden, full of slowly drifting dust particles, each one catching the light for a moment and glowing like a tiny star, then drifting on into shadow. In this light, the work was beautiful. Not just good, beautiful, in the way that things sometimes become beautiful, when light falls on them at exactly the right angle. The maps looked, in this light, like objects from a dream. The colours were richer. The lines seemed more certain, more present. The small decorative elements, the sea creatures, the compass roses, the elaborate cartouches with their scroll work and shadows, seemed to move slightly, as if they might at any moment leave the paper and enter the room. Sandro also worked more slowly in this light. He worked with particular care. Sometimes he would hold a finished section up to the window and let the light fall through it. The paper translucent in the direct sunlight. The ink darker and more opaque. The whole thing glowing. "You have to know how a thing will look in different light," he said once, holding a map up to the window. "Not just in here, in candlelight, in sunlight, in the grey light of a cloudy day at sea. A map must be readable in all of them, and beautiful in at least one." Giacomo remembered this. It seemed to him a good principle, not just for maps, but for many things. To work for usefulness first, but to believe that usefulness and beauty were not opposites. That with enough care and practice and love for the work, a thing could be both. Venice rested on water. This was a fact so basic that the people who lived there rarely thought about it. But occasionally, in the late evening, or very early in the morning before the city had fully woken, or in the heavy stillness of a summer afternoon, Giacomo would become suddenly aware of it. He would be walking over a bridge and look down, and there would be the water, dark and deep, and right there, just beneath the stone. He would think, the whole city is floating. Not floating exactly. The buildings were built on wooden piles, driven deep into the mud of the lagoon floor. A fact that still struck him as remarkable, that all of this stone and brick and marble rested ultimately on wood buried in mud, but floating in the sense that mattered, surrounded on all sides by water, dependent on the water, inseparable from the water. The city and the lagoon were a single thing. You could not understand one without the other. The city gave the lagoon its meaning. The lagoon gave the city its character, its light, its smell, its particular quality of stillness. In Venice, the water was always with you, always just there. You could hear it, you could smell it. When the tide was high, it sometimes came up over the edge of the lower quaysides, a thin sheet of water spreading quietly across the stone, dark and clear, lying perfectly flat. The old Venetians called this aqua alta, high water. They did not panic when it came. They set out their boards, long wooden planks raised on small legs, creating elevated walkways above the flooded pavement, and they continued. They continued their shopping, and their visiting, and their working. They lifted their skirts and their hems, and they walked across the boards. They adapted, as they had always adapted, to the particular demands of living in a city that was, at its heart, aquatic. Giacomo found the aqua altar beautiful. He knew this was not the universal view. He knew it was inconvenient and, in serious instances, damaging. But there was something in the image of the water, quietly spreading across the stone. The city, accepting it, accommodating it, finding a way to simply continue, that moved him. It seemed to him that Venice had learned something that was very hard to learn. That sometimes you cannot fight what is coming. That sometimes the water rises, and there is nothing to be done about it. And the only wisdom is to raise your boards, lift your hem, and keep walking. Over the years, Giacomo and Sandro developed the particular closeness of two people who work side by side in silence for a long time. It was not a closeness built on conversation. They talked, of course, about the work, about the maps, about the travellers who came with their information, occasionally about other things. But the heart of their relationship was the work itself, the shared experience of being in a room together, doing a thing they both cared about. For hours and days and years, Giacomo came to know Sandro's moods by the sound of his pen. When the work was going well, the pen moved quickly and steadily, a confident sound, like someone who knows exactly where they are going. When something was difficult, a coastline that wouldn't resolve into the right shape, a calculation that seemed to contradict itself, the pen moved more slowly. There were pauses, a sound like a very quiet exhalation. And Giacomo learned to recognize these sounds and to respond to them, not by offering solutions or commentary, but by making himself very quiet, by bringing the brazier a little closer on cold days, by ensuring that the right inks were freshly mixed and ready when needed, by being, in other words, a good presence in the room, a calm and useful presence, a presence that did not add to the difficulty of the difficult moment, but simply held steady beside it. Sandro, in turn, learned to recognize when Giacomo was in the state of flow, when the work was moving through him rather than being dragged out of him. On these occasions, Sandro was very still. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. He let the flow continue for as long as it would. Once, on such an afternoon, Giacomo worked for nearly 4 hours without lifting his head. He finished the entire C-section of a large map, the colouring, the shading, the placement of the compass rose, the small sea creatures in the border, the lettering of all the names. When he finally stopped and looked up, the light was nearly gone from the sky. Sandro was sitting at his own table, not working, just present, waiting, without hurry, for Giacomo to surface. Giacomo looked at what he'd done. "It's good," Sandro said. Not effusively, not expansively. Simply, with certainty. "It's good." That was enough. More than enough. When Giacomo had been in the workshop for about 15 years, Sandro announced that they would attempt something they had never attempted before. A map of the world. Not a partial map. Not a map of one sea, or one continent, or one trading route. A map of the entire world. Such maps had been made before. The Portuguese and Spanish explorers of the previous century had pushed the edges of the known world outward, had sailed west and found continents that the old maps did not contain, had sailed south and east and around Africa to reach India, had begun to accumulate knowledge of coastlines and oceans that no previous generation had possessed. But this knowledge was scattered. It existed in 100 different charts and logs and travelers' accounts. The task of a world map was to bring it all together, to synthesize, to reconcile, to make a single coherent picture from 1,000 pieces of incomplete information. They knew the map would be imperfect. They accepted this from the beginning. There were parts of the world, vast stretches of the interior of continents, entire coastlines, whole oceans that no European had yet travelled. These would have to be left blank, or filled with the honest admission of ignorance, the decorative monsters and speculative mountains that said, in their visual language, "Here we do not yet know." The work took 3 years. 3 years of gathering and comparing and debating and drawing and revising. 3 years of sailors' accounts and merchants' diaries and scholarly correspondence and old maps spread across every surface in the workshop. The big map grew slowly. It was too large for the work table. They had built a special frame for it, and it leaned against one wall of the workshop for most of those 3 years, slowly filling in, slowly becoming more itself. Giacomo spent long hours standing in front of it, just looking, trying to hold in his mind the entirety of what they were attempting. The whole curve of the earth, laid flat. Every ocean, every continent, every known island. All of it on one sheet of paper. All of it held still, just for a moment, in marks of ink. There were days when this felt impossible, when the task seemed larger than any task should be allowed to be, when the blank spaces seemed too large, the discrepancies between accounts too numerous, the uncertainty too vast. On these days, Giacomo would step back from the large map and return to smaller work. He would spend an afternoon on a detail. One small island, one harbour entrance, one precise stretch of coastline that he could get exactly right. He would work on the small, perfect thing. And the working on the small thing would, in some way he couldn't fully explain, restore his ability to approach the large thing. Start with what you can hold, he told himself, and let the rest come. Slowly, the blank spaces filled. The Americas took shape on the left side of the map, strange and enormous, their western coasts barely sketched, their interiors almost entirely unknown, but their eastern coasts growing steadily more detailed and accurate as more sailors' accounts reached them. Africa found its true shape, larger than anyone had quite realized, extending much further south than old maps had suggested, rounding at its bottom into the cold waters that connected the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Asia stretched east, enormous and various, the great mountain ranges at its center, the long coastline of India, the scattered islands further east. Japan, a set of islands farthest of all, drawn from a single sailor's account and marked with an honest footnote acknowledging the uncertainty. After 3 years, in the late afternoon of a day in October, with the light coming through the window at that particular oblique angle that turned everything golden, Sandro set down his pen. He stood back from the map. He looked at it for a long time. He said nothing. Giacomo stood beside him, also looking, also silent. The map was not perfect. They both knew this. There were coasts that were wrong, and distances that were off, and blank spaces where the world continued to be unknown. But it was honest. It represented the best knowledge of that moment. It was made with care and integrity, and Giacomo thought, with love. The love that serious craftspeople bring to serious work. It will do. Sandro said finally. And from Sandro, this was the highest praise. After work, in the evenings, Giacomo often walked. He walked without destination. Or rather, his destination was the walking itself. The city, the evening light, the simple pleasure of moving through a place he knew so well that he barely needed to think about where he was going. Venice in the evening had a particular quality. The heat of the day, in summer, was dissipating. The shadows were long and blue. The light on the upper portions of buildings was still warm and golden, while the lower portions, near the water, were already in shadow. People were moving through the streets, heading home, heading to a friend's house, heading to one of the small osterie, where they would drink rough wine and eat simple food, and talk for hours about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered. Giacomo sometimes stopped at such a place himself. He would sit with a glass of wine and watch the other patrons, the fishermen still smelling of the sea, the merchants with ink on their fingers from the day's accounts, the gondoliers in their distinctive clothes, the occasional scholar or cleric or traveller. He listened to conversations without particularly eavesdropping, just the texture of them, the rise and fall of voices, the laughter, the sound of the city talking to itself at the end of another day. Then he would walk again, over the bridges, along the narrower calle, the small streets, barely wide enough for two people to pass, where the buildings came so close overhead that you could almost touch both walls at once. Through the wider camping, the little squares that opened up unexpectedly in the middle of the city's maze, with their central wells and their churches and their trees that somehow managed to grow in the restricted soil. He would stop sometimes and look up at the sky. In the narrow streets, the sky was just a strip, a ribbon of darkening blue between the rooflines. Stars appeared in it, one by one, the way things important often appear, quietly, without announcement, becoming visible only when you are still enough to notice them. He thought, on these walks, about very little, or about everything. He was not sure which. His mind moved in the same way his body moved, without urgency, without a fixed destination, following the path that seemed right. As the years passed, the workshop changed. Sandro grew older. His hands, always capable, became a little slower. The fine lines of his lettering, always precise, became occasionally uncertain in ways they never had before. He did not speak of this. He simply adjusted. He moved to work that required less fineness. He concentrated on the aspects of map-making that needed experience and judgment more than steady hands. The decisions about projection and scale, the reconciliation of conflicting accounts, the overall composition of a large map. And Giacomo's hands took over the fineness. Naturally, without discussion, just as things shift between people who understand each other. There was a morning. Giacomo remembered it clearly, though many mornings had blurred together, when he realized that the workshop was now his, as much as it was Sandro's. Not in any legal sense, not because of any explicit transfer of authority, but because he was doing the work fully, making the decisions, solving the problems, and Sandro was trusting him with this. It was a quiet kind of responsibility, a quiet kind of honor. He tried to be worthy of it every day, not dramatically, just by showing up, by doing the work well, by paying attention. Sandro died in the winter of a year when Giacomo was in his mid-40s. He died in the morning, at home, peacefully, in the small room he had occupied for decades, with the sound of the canal outside his window. Giacomo went to the workshop the following morning, as he always did. He wasn't sure what else to do. He sat at the work table. He looked at the map that was currently in progress, a chart of the eastern Mediterranean, half complete, Sandro's marks and his own marks side by side on the paper. He picked up his pen, and he continued, because the work continued, because the world continued to need maps, because the work was what he knew how to do, because in a way, doing it was a form of honouring the man who had taught him. He worked alone from that point on. Not entirely alone. There were occasional assistants, young people who came to learn as he had once come to learn, but essentially alone. Himself and the work. He found that he did not mind this. He had always, at heart, been the still one, the quiet one, the one who was most comfortable in the company of work and water and light. His life settled into a rhythm that suited him exactly. The walk, the workshop, the long hours of careful work, the walk home, the evening meal, the window overlooking the canal, the maps on the walls of his room, gently breathing in the night air. He was not a man to whom great events happened, no dramatic rescues, no extraordinary adventures, no sudden reversals of fortune. He simply lived his life carefully and attentively, doing work he believed in a city he loved, one day at a time. And this, he had come to understand, was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Toward the end of his working life, Giacomo spent more time thinking about what maps were, not how to make them. He knew how to make them. That knowledge lived in his hands. But what they were, what purpose they served, what they could and could not do. A map, he had come to understand, was always a simplification. The world was infinitely complex. Every coastline had more detail than any map could hold. Every city was richer and stranger than any mark on paper could capture. Every ocean was more various and alive than any painted surface could suggest. A map was a choice about what mattered and what could be left out, and how much detail served understanding, and how much would simply overwhelm. The mapmaker looked at the world and decided, this is what you need to know. This, and not that. Here, and at this scale. With these things marked, and these things left unmarked. This was an act of tremendous responsibility, and of tremendous humility. You could never be entirely right. You could never capture the whole truth. All you could do was be as honest as possible, and acknowledge, through the blank spaces and the tentative lines, what you did not know. He thought sometimes that life was similar, that each person's understanding of their own life was, in a sense, a kind of map, a simplification, a set of choices about what mattered and what could be left out. A picture that was never entirely accurate, but that was, if you were careful and honest, useful. You drew the best map you could. You revised it as new information came. You held it lightly, knowing it was only a representation, not the thing itself, and you tried to leave space. Space for the things you didn't yet know. Space for the blank places that would eventually be filled. Space for the world to be more than your map of it. In the last years of his working life, Giacomo made a map he had never planned to make. He made a map of Venice. Not a map for merchants or sailors or scholars. Not a map to be sold or copied or sent to distant libraries. A map for himself. Just for himself. He made it slowly, over the course of many months, He worked on it in the evenings, in his room, at the same small table where he had practiced his lettering as a young man, by candlelight. The flame casting its warm, unsteady light across the paper, making the ink glow. He drew Venice as he knew it, not as it appeared in official surveys, not as it appeared in any other map, as he knew it, as a person who had walked its streets and crossed its bridges and watched its water for more than 40 years. He drew the Rialto Bridge, where he had stood as a boy watching the boats. He drew the square near his mother's house, where he had played as a child. He drew the route he walked each morning to the workshop. He drew the workshop itself, a small, carefully rendered building on its island, with a window facing the lagoon. And inside that window, barely visible, the suggestion of a figure at work. He drew the osteria, where he sometimes drank his evening wine. He drew the baker Pietro's shop, and the bridge with the slight sway in it, and the building with the carved stone face above the doorway. He drew Signora Caterina's building, and his own window above it, and the narrow canal below. He drew every bridge he had ever crossed, every campo he had ever rested in, every canal he had ever crossed by boat. And in the margins of this map, instead of sea creatures and cartographic decoration, he drew small moments. The stripe of morning light on the workshop floor, a gondola moving through early fog, a cat on a windowsill watching the canal, 2 sparrows on the edge of a fountain, a hand holding a pen above a blank sheet of paper. The map was not accurate in any cartographic sense. The proportions were slightly off. The distances were adjusted by feeling rather than measurement. The things that had mattered most in his life were drawn larger than their actual size would suggest. The ordinary pathways were central. The grand monuments were present, but not dominant. It was, in other words, a true map. Not geographically true, but emotionally, experientially, humanly true. He pinned it to the wall of his room. Among all the other maps, the oceans and continents and distant islands, the world in all its complexity and scale, this small, personal, slightly imperfect map of the city he had lived in all his life. He looked at it often, in the evenings, in the warm light of his candle, in the mornings, when the stripe of light from the window fell across the floor, at night, in the half-dark, when the city was quiet and only the sound of water remained. It made him feel something he found difficult to name. Not nostalgia, exactly. Not pride. Something quieter than either. Something that was perhaps simply gratitude. Gratitude for the city, for the work, for the long, unhurried life he had been given to live in this particular place. In the deep hours of the night, Venice belonged to the water. The city was quiet. The voices and the footsteps and the creak of boats, all of it stilled. And then you could hear the water clearly, the canal outside the window, moving very slightly, the smallest possible movement against the stone. It was a sound like breathing, slow and even and continuous. A sound that had been there before the city was built, and would be there after. A sound that was older than any map. Giacomo lay in his bed in the darkness and listened to this sound. He had listened to it for 40 years. He would never tire of it. The water against the stone. The city breathing. The lagoon out beyond the buildings, lying flat and dark and still under the stars. Somewhere out on the water, a bell rang, distant and soft. One of the church towers, counting the hours. The sound arrived slowly across the water. It did not demand attention. It simply offered itself, and then it faded. And there was only the water again. Slow, steady, patient. Giacomo closed his eyes. The maps on his walls were invisible in the darkness, but he knew they were there. He could feel their presence the way you feel the presence of familiar things. Not by seeing them, but by knowing they are yours. The world held still in ink on paper. All its oceans, all its coasts, all its distant islands and mountains and wide plains, all its blank spaces still waiting to be known, and beneath all of it, quietly, the sound of water. Let the story rest here for a moment. Just here, in this room, with the sound of the canal below, with the maps on the walls, with the candle burning low. There is nothing required of you, nothing to remember, nothing to hold. Let Giacomo's city be your city for a while. Let the water outside your window be his water. Let the night air smell of stone and salt, and the particular coolness of a city built on the sea. Imagine the bridges, one by one, the worn stone underfoot, the slight curve of the arch, the view from the centre, and the canal stretching away in both directions, fading into the soft dark. Imagine the water, dark and still and deep, the reflections of stars in it, wavering, breaking apart when a small wave passes, reassembling themselves. Imagine the workshop in the moonlight, empty now, quiet, the work table bare, the maps rolled and put away, the ink jars sealed and lined up on their shelf, the pen resting, everything at rest. Imagine the city sleeping, all its inhabitants in their narrow houses, in their rooms above the canals, dreaming whatever they dream, of distant lands, of people they love, of nothing at all, of the particular formless movement of the sleeping mind. The water moves beneath them all, holding them, patient and ancient and kind. You are very close to sleep now, or perhaps you are already there, already on the other side of the threshold, where the story and the dream become the same thing. That is all right, more than all right. Let Giacomo's voice be the last voice, the sound of the pen, the scratch of ink on paper, the slow construction of a world from marks and lines and care. Let the canal be the sound beneath everything, beneath the sleeping city, beneath your breathing, beneath the quiet of this room where you are lying. The water, against stone, breathing. The stars above the lagoon, too numerous to count, reflected below in the dark water, so that you cannot tell any more where the sky ends and the sea begins. The map cannot capture this. Some things are too present for maps, too alive, but the mapmaker knows. He has looked at this sky, this water, this city, for a long time. He knows its shape, not just the geographic shape, but the shape of it in his heart, the shape of a life, one ordinary, extraordinary life, spent in careful attention, in love of a place, in service of a craft, in the slow, patient, beautiful work of trying to show others where things are. And now the candle is nearly out, a small bright point in the darkness, growing smaller, and the city sleeps, and the maps dream their dreams of coastlines, and the water moves, quietly, beneath everything. Sleep now.